All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Matterhorn Express Pipeline webinar. My name is Avalon Powell. I am the marketing manager for Braun Gesham, and I'll be assisting our presenters, Patrick Reznik and Carly Barton, with moderating questions this evening. So this webinar is scheduled for approximately an hour. Patrick and Carly, who are condemnation attorneys with our firm, will discuss the Matterhorn Pipeline's project details. They'll provide a map of the proposed pipeline route, talk about some of the negatives of having a gas pipeline on your property, and outline the condemnation process if you are an impacted landowner. So we will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation today, but if you have a question that comes up, please feel free to submit that at any time. You can do so by using the Q&A feature of Zoom. So if you scroll over your Zoom screen, you should see a toolbar pop up at either the top or the bottom of that screen. And on there is an option for Q&A. If you click that, it will actually open up a separate pop-up box and you can type your questions directly in. And then after the webinar, we will follow up with a copy of this presentation's recording and provide our contact information in case you have any questions that come up after this. And without further ado, Patrick and Carly, feel free to take it away.
Carly's going to start.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. So glad you can join us. I will start sharing my screen and get us started with our presentation here. Here we go. So as Avalon said, we're going to be discussing the Matterhorn Express Pipeline. This is a community webinar so that we can cover some of the scope of the project, what to expect, what's it like to be condemned when a 42-inch natural gas pipeline comes through your property, and kind of those considerations and what it could mean for impacted landowners. We've got Patrick Reznik and of course myself, Carly Barton. So we're very excited to talk to you here today. These are kind of that outline of what we'll be covering. First is what we know about the project, really kind of what the path of is it. We're going to share with you our interactive map that I hope some of y'all have seen. What is a pipeline routing process? Is there really a process? And why is it going through my land? The negatives of having a gas pipeline on your property, and then the condemnation process and negotiations that happen when they decide to come across your property. So.
Well, thank you, Carly. A little bit more about our firm and Carly and me in particular. We only represent landowners in condemnation proceedings. Some attorneys represent both condemnors who are taking your land, and then condemnees who are landowners whose land is being taken. And when I say taken, this is not a sale. This is a condemnation proceeding where companies have eminent domain authority in order to take your land. So we only represent landowners around the state of Texas. We're very passionate about landowners' rights, and taking care of the land and being good stewards. This is a general map for the Matterhorn Express Pipeline. You can see toward Pecos and Midland, Odessa, that is Upton County, where it starts, and then it ends towards Houston, which is Waller and Fort Bend counties. You can see that right there, and into Houston, Harris County. The project is a high-pressure natural gas pipeline in order to get the gas from the Permian Basin to a processing facility or facilities near Houston in order to clean it, compress it, and turn it in most likely into NGL, which is a liquid compressed gas. Most of that gas is going to be shipped overseas, is what we understand it. So most of that gas is not going to be used by the citizens of the United States, but it'll be used for citizens across the world. In particular, I think this project has been rushed because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the natural gas situations and limited supplies that Europe has experienced in order to facilitate some relief in that regard. There's a lot of natural gas in Texas, And the idea is to not flare it or waste it, but to get it to some sort of market. But what that does is impacts the landowners along the way. So there's around 14 or so counties that are impacted between Middle and Odessa, Pecos, and Houston, who will be taking another pipeline for some instances and a new pipeline in a lot of respects. So the next slide, Carly, shows that we have an interactive map on our website. What we have done, in fact, I'll let Carly explain this, and I think she can show you, if you go online, what you're going to see.
Yeah, so if we go to the link provided there, let me get to my website. I have to change what I'm sharing with y'all, so give me a second. There we go. All right, so if you go to the Matterhorn, if you go to our website, this is where it'll take you. We have a basic overview, but if you scroll down, there's click here for an interactive map. So that takes us to the an ArcGIS geographic information system. So this is satellite imagery. This is a map that's going to pinpoint exactly, as close as we can, what the path of the pipeline is. So if you look, this is the overview, right? Very similar. We pulled these from our from Matterhorn's website, but what we did for the landowners, really, because you're kind of in the dark, it's hard to know what the path is. But what we did was we put that, we matched that pathway over the properties, and then identified what potentially impacted properties would be through the appraisal district records. So if you scroll in here, we're just north of Georgetown, you can see where those properties, you have those blue squares, those are potentially impacted properties. And you can even click on it and it'll give you, and like I said, that's information, is public information from in this case, Williamson Central Appraisal District. So you can look and see if you are an impacted property, or if you're looking at a potentially impacted property. This isn't an exact map because as Patrick will explain, the company does not have to give us that information at this point, or give us that information for with that much detail for the entire project. But this is it's a pretty good guess about what could be potentially impacted. Additionally, what we did do in this for this particular project, for the Matterhorn Express Pipeline, is that there are some points of when this pipeline will be paralleling another pipeline in the area. And so we get you can see that with the little black line that's going through here. So we do have the potential of some of these properties, they're getting, this ranch is going to be hit twice. There's already a pipeline on there, and then there's another pipeline being built, which, while our friends out in West Texas and South Texas are used to having, and even, closer to Houston, are used to having those multiple pipelines and, having more of a corridor, that is something a little newer for the Williamson County area and Burnett, and as we go out west, it's not something that we've seen a ton of in this area. So again, you can zoom in, you can zoom out as much as you want. You can see where it's going here in Burnett up to Lampasas, just north of San Saba. You can kind of see this other pipeline that's running down there. And then eventually crosses, it picks up another one when we get to Eden in Concho County. So we've got, there's a lot of good information on just by a map that landowners can look at and try to understand a little bit more about the path and how it might be impacting their property. As I said, you can really zoom in a lot for a lot of detail. So you could get to the you can try to predict as much as possible the path of how it might be, either bisecting your property or crossing it. So that is the ArcGIS.
The reason we did this is because we want landowners in the state of Texas to be able to have a resource, since it's not public available through Matterhorn Company or through the Railroad Commission about where this new pipeline is going to go. People who are buying and selling property would like to know, at least most people would like to know, whether or not they're buying a piece of property that's going to have a new 42-inch natural gas pipeline, or whether or not they're buying a property that's close to that, and whether they're going to build a home maybe within 1,000 feet of the neighbor who is going to have the pipeline. It may not be on their property, but it's just information. It's good to know. And there was no place to, as we'll explain later, there's really no place to find this information. This is the second time we did this. We did this with the Kinder Morgan Permian Highway pipeline that went through Texas Hill Country, also a similar situation where it's a 42-inch natural gas line from Houston to the Permian Basin a number of years ago. We found it very effective. It is a service we're providing to the community, and anybody can go to this website and find it. There's no obligation, and we're not going to be taking your information if you look into it and sending you letters as a result. So it's not a direct marketing tool for us. It really is for information. So if you have any questions about it as you go through it, please let us know, and we're happy to answer those particular questions. Let's talk more about this particular project. As I mentioned, it's a 42-inch natural gas pipeline. 42 inches is a large pipeline. I'm 6 feet tall, and it's not quite as tall as me, but it's big when you think about the diameter of 42 inches. At a minimum, it will be 3 feet. A lot of people ask, well, what's the requirement under state or federal law? Well, there really is not. 3 feet is the typical depth that the pipeline companies, and that means 3 feet from the top of the pipe to the top of the ground. There are some situations in especially coastal Bend and even in other areas where farmers can plow deeper than 3 feet. So it can be a real concern. So sometimes we try to negotiate in certain situations a deeper burying of the pipeline for sometimes 5 feet, but 3 feet is going to be the minimum. There's two types of easements in this situation. One is a permanent easement. A 50-foot permanent easement, the pipe will go in the middle of that particular permanent easement. So there'll be 25 feet on each side of the center line of the particular pipe. And that's not the slide we were wanting, but the permanent easement will be just that. It's permanent. And it will be an easement across the landowner's property that the landowner still owns the land, but Matterhorn will have the rights to install the pipeline, maintain the pipeline, and you'll have a third party on your property as having access to that particular easement really whenever they want. And that is a problem for a lot of landowners who like their privacy, and ranches who have various operations. And that's just how this situation works. And that's how the infrastructure is built. And these easements are built for this particular purpose for the public. And yes, they do have eminent domain authority, even though it is a private company that's doing it, because this is gas and among other reasons. Now, in addition to a 50-foot permanent easement, there's a 75-foot temporary easement utilized for staging and for construction. The equipment that is used to trench these pipelines and put in these large pieces of pipe and welded together is very, very large and very, very massive and very, very efficient. Now, if there's any trees or shrubs or brush in the 50-foot or 75-foot, that will be removed. So you're looking at 125 foot of clearing. When the Kinder Morgan Permian Highway pipeline came through the heavily treed, wooded hill country for the first time, and as a pipeline through that area, people were very upset as their trees are now gone. And that's just how the company works. That's how they operate, and it's lawful, and that's how they're allowed to do it. So this line is about 580 mile route. We estimate it's at least 1,700 plus landowners are going to be impacted in this 14 or so county area. Matterhorn says they want to begin construction in June 23. I don't believe it. Right now, the stage of the process for most landowners is the surveys have happened. Initial offers have come out, but they don't have even a survey. Initial offers are coming out without an actual survey. Survey companies are very far behind. Appraisers are very far behind. And Carla will talk more about the process and what to expect. But I think June of 2023 to begin construction, quite frankly, is unrealistic. Concluded by 2024 and in service by 2024, I think is unrealistic. But what this means is that Matterhorn is behind schedule, which means they're going to most likely, in my opinion, be very aggressive as far as acquiring easements and the right to go ahead and construct this particular pipeline. And Carly will talk about how they get those rights to construct the pipeline, because right now they don't have that. That you have to go through the condemnation process as a general rule in order to get those rights to actually build. So that's in general what we know right now and what we're seeing across this particular project in multiple counties. Routing process, we talked about this, and the reason we put it the interactive map is because there is no public routing process. How is that route chosen? Well, Matterhorn, years ago, I don't know how many, but they're in their conference rooms. They're looking at the business model, and they're looking at particular routes on how they get this gas from the Permian Basin to the processing facilities near Houston, and they pick a route. And there is no public routing process before the Railroad Commission. And what's interesting, unlike high voltage transmission lines, which I'm going to give you an example before the Public Utility Commission, there is a public process. So a high voltage transmission line, and if you look around the landscape, they're all over the state. And with the snowpocalypse from last February and the extreme heats and extreme colds, there's concern about having enough electricity. So you're seeing more and more transmission lines being built in order to process electricity and essentially pipe it across the state of Texas. Transmission lines that are high voltage are essentially a pipeline for electricity. But in that process, when a utility company wants to build a new transmission line, they have to actually file an application with the Public Utility Commission, the PUC, with multiple potential routes. And the next slide shows a case that we did a number of years ago down in South Texas, Zapata, Starr County, down all the way to Edinburgh and McAllen and all the way up to Laredo. This is a what's called a 345 kilovolt line. Now, the yellow line is the route that this utility company wanted to build. We represented a large number of landowners who, the circles you can see, we didn't want that brand new transmission line going through virgin territory, and it's above ground. It's unsightly as compared to a pipeline, which is under the ground, especially in South Texas. They're used to pipelines. They're not used to these big transmission lines. So we were able to convince the Public Utility Commission to go with the green route rather than the yellow route. Now, all those hatch mark lines that you see on these particular maps are potential routes. So there's multiple potential routes that the application with the utility company put before the Public Utility Commission, but they only need one. When it comes to gas lines, petroleum lines, water lines, wastewater lines, there is no such process that is public. And while we showed you the map of where we think the route is for Matterhorn, that's subject to change. Matterhorn can work with landowners, or when they start construction, or surveys, they find impediments and they have to relocate the route. They are able to do that. On a high voltage transmission line, once the Public Utility Commission issues an order saying the green route is the route, there's very limited deviations for that particular route. It has to stay on the landowner, and the landowner can work with the utility company to make some minor deviations. But there's a very different process for this as compared to the pipelines. Frankly, we've gone to the Texas legislature over the years trying to get the legislature to create a system by which there's more transparency and that there's a routing process with the pipeline companies, just like the transmission lines. To date, that has not happened. The idea of a natural gas pipeline, especially one that is high pressure, causes concerns for a lot of landowners. Now, while it is, I admit, safer than transporting by rail or transporting by truck, it still has the issues related to health risks caused by potential leaks, potential explosions. If you look at or read the news, there are explosions that happen. There are leaks that happen when it comes to natural gas. Do they happen very often? No. Fortunately, they're seldomly cause the loss of life, but over the last couple of years, there's been several situations where people have actually died as a result of various gas lines being exploded. But more importantly, not more importantly, but importantly from a landowner perspective, when you buy or sell real estate, there's a stigma associated with having a 42-inch high-pressure natural gas pipeline on your property. Whether it's real or not, if somebody is going to buy a piece of property with a pipeline, they typically are going to want to pay less money. And if a landowner is going to get a new pipeline such as this, that's a natural gas pipeline, most landowners believe as a result, their property values have now decreased as compared to where they were because there's what's called an encumbrance. They now have a 42-inch natural gas pipeline that they didn't have before. And the explosion extent, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but it's highly technical and gets into a lot of mathematical equations. But the potential impact radius, known as the PIR, is basically an area of a circle in which if there's a failure of the pipeline, whether it's a leak or an explosion, that there's a certain level of risk associated with a certain distance. And that relates to the pressure of the line inside the line and the size of the diameter of the line. And we'll talk about that in a second. But another thing is landowners have concerns about is, one, their trees, if they have trees, are going to be removed. And then the topsoil may not actually get back onto the top, even though we work with the utility, with the pipeline companies to do what we call double ditch. That means you take the topsoil off, you put it to the side, you put it in the pipe, then you put the topsoil back on. However, there's still permanent scarring and certain risk associated with the pipeline. The next slide shows a client of ours. This is actually in Nolan County, in which the pipeline was put in. And now it all depends a lot on the soils. Certain areas have lots of rocky soils. This particular area has pretty sandy, loam type of soils. And this is in front of this client's home. And this crosses the driveway. The next slide shows, if you look at after the installation of the pipeline, they got some heavy rains. And look what happened is it completely caved in. And the pipeline, you can see the route of the pipeline, but it completely collapsed, not the pipe, but the soil above, because it was not compacted correctly. You would think that the company would go out immediately, rectify this, bring in additional topsoil and fix this. No, what they did was bring in from a local feedlot a bunch of cow manure that had been scraped and piled up in the feedlot. And filled that in with all of these areas. We tried to negotiate without having to file a lawsuit, but we actually had to file a lawsuit in order to get them to fix this and pay the landowner for the additional damages caused as a result of the contractors improperly installing the pipeline with sufficient compaction on top of the pipeline. So things like this, unfortunately, do happen, and those are risks that are involved that landowners would rather, as a general rule, not deal with, even though they're going to get paid. Now, we're going to get to payment here in a second, but I want to go back to what we call the potential impact radius. This is a chart that is publicly available for the Pipeline Association of Public Awareness, and I find it very, very useful. On the left-hand side is the pressure, and the right-hand side is the size of the pipeline. So if you go to the top right, you see 42. That is the size of this particular pipeline. The pressure is around 1440. So you have to extrapolate between 1400 and 1500 on the far left if you look at the pressures, and extrapolate between 3583 and 3709. What does that mean? Well, that is this association's recommended minimum evacuation distance, meaning if there's an explosion or even a leak, that would be the evacuation that is recommended based on the pressure and the size of the particular pipeline. As you can see, the distance goes less as the pipe gets smaller in diameter or as the pressure decreases. The next slide shows what we know from the Kinder Morgan Permian Highway pipeline that has already been installed. It was also at 1440 psi, so the recommended evacuation distance is 3633. Now, what's interesting about this particular project, what I understand is that Kinder Morgan is adding additional facilities in order to process additional gas. Well, if they're going to process additional gas, what that generally means that there's going to be more gas that's going to come through the pipe. If there's more gas that's going to come through the pipe, that means there's going to be increase in pressure. So the 1440 psi that was initially told is most likely to increase. What that is, I don't know. But there's also a lot of controversy, quite frankly, in the industry related to the pipelines, PIR, again, potential impact ratios. There are some mathematical calculations that basically, and some science behind it, that says 1,100 feet is the evacuation issue related to whether or not, if there's an explosion, whether you can survive. And what this mathematical model says is that you have a 99% chance of surviving for 30 seconds within 1,100 feet. So you've got 30 seconds to get 1,100 feet beyond in order to not be injured. That is, like I say, admittedly controversial, but the data is there to support it. We use this data when we work on these cases for our landowners, because what this means is that it's data that supports a stigma associated with having a high pressure natural gas pipeline on your property and the concerns of if there might be an explosion. So if somebody wants to build a really nice home, let's say it's a $500 to $2 million home, whatever, next to the pipeline, are they going to want to put it within 1,100 feet? Maybe, maybe not. But the concern is that in your backyard, you have this high pressure gas line. Most people say, you know, I was going to build a home and now the pipeline is going there. Now I can't build a home. If you only have 20 acres and the pipeline's going through it, you don't have a place to put your home. If you got 100 acres, you might. It all depends on the size of the property. Here's what we know from this particular project, and we anticipate some similar situations going forward with the Matterhorn pipeline, is if you look at what the next slide, Carly, if you look at what the data, oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. I am going to relinquish now to have, is that the next slide?
This is the next slide.
Okay, then you go.
Okay.
Carly's, for y'all, Carly's driving, and so I'm relying on her on the slides. So.
Well, we're going to take a little bit of a break from the impact of the property and the damages and what can be expected in terms of compensation and how it's calculated. But we're going to take a little break from that to talk about what is eminent domain, what is condemnation, what can you expect if your property is being condemned from the process, and how do they have the right to do that. So we'll start with the beginning, right? The right to eminent domain comes from essentially three different places. The first, of course, is the U.S. Constitution, that the Fifth Amendment requires the government to compensate its citizens when it takes private property for public use. Under the Texas Constitution, Article 1, Section 17 also provides that no person's property shall be taken, damaged, or destroyed for or applied to the public use without adequate compensation being made. A lot of times you'll hear this being a term called just compensation. And really what this means is that in order for someone to come and take your land, they are supposed to be giving you what you would receive on the free and fair market. It is supposed to be adequate and correct compensation. Is it that every time? Probably not. And they very frequently lowball you, but we'll get into that. And then lastly, Chapter 21 of the Texas Property Code, that is the specifics of what the companies have to do to acquire their eminent domain power, and then what the condemnation process is. What are the steps they have to take with each landowner to make sure that they've followed the rules that they're supposed to follow. So what are some special considerations for landowners impacted by condemnation? So you are, as Patrick talked about, and we saw some pictures, you're going to be facing a changed property use, whether you like it or not. You won't be able to build on your easement. You won't be, with these bigger pipelines, you can't run a road over it, or if you do, it has to be perpendicular, not parallel. There's a bunch of things that occur that restrict your use and change the way you can use your property. And of course, it decreases your property values as well. And that, unfortunately, that's to the detriment of the landowner. But if you want to have a big impact in the condemnation process and you want to understand it and be prepared, having an experienced team of professionals will help you tremendously. And in this case, we're not even just talking about lawyers. We're talking about appraisers who know how to calculate the damage of a pipeline, that the pipeline is going to be on your property, or a land planner, or sometimes an engineer to determine what you might need to do with your property. There are many professionals that go into the condemnation process. And so you always want to make sure that you have some good advice on that side, because I'll be very honest with you. I find that most of the right-of-way agents or the people that come out, the first people you see from the pipeline company, they're trying to get you to sign an easement for the cheapest deal, and move on. And they've got to start that construction. They got to get this done. They've promised investors that this pipeline is going to be functioning by the third quarter. So they're really pushing and pushing. They're not out there to look for you. They're not out there in your best interest. And so that's why it is really important to have, some professionals on your side. But the first step in the condemnation process, so eminent domain is the power to condemn, and then condemnation is the process of which a company exercises their eminent domain power. But the first part of it is the initial contact, the call from the landman or the right-of-way agent, the visit, or the letter posted on your gate that you got in the mail. That's the very beginning. That's how a lot of these projects, how you learn about it. Your neighbor got something and it starts trickling, and everyone starts figuring out, oh, there's something going on. Because as Patrick talked about, we're not a part of the routing process, and they just get to pick the route. So this is kind of the first part of, okay, well, there's a route, kind of, we hear that they're starting to come this way and contact landowners. The second part is negotiating your terms and compensation. So that first stage, you'll get a letter, you'll get some initial offers and some correspondence that way. And then the second part, you can negotiate your terms and compensation, see if there's a way that you and the gas company can agree on money and what they can do to your property. There are some limitations, not only just regulatory, but just the willingness of the natural gas company to to really bargain with you, but negotiating your terms of your easement is an underrated part of the process. It's not just about getting you the most money, but also trying to make the whole process of the pipeline coming across your property a little more comfortable, if we can help it. The third phase is special commissioners hearing. And the fourth phase is the district court, or finding yourself in district court or county court at law. And we're going to go into some more details about each of these. So the very beginning, we've got the initial offer and the final offer. So after you get the call or you get something in the mail from the right-of-way agent, they'll have what the companies have to send you based on the Texas Property Code, Chapter 21, is a bona fide offer. Okay, so that just means a real offer, that it is usually has a 30-day deadline. It is their initial offer many of times, and they put these deadlines that I will tell you right now they're fake for the most part. They're not real. They're just trying to add pressure to the situation to make the landowner feel uncomfortable. So you'll get that initial offer. Many times it's low, but then you'll get a later final offer. They'll tell you it's a final offer, that it has part of that final offer has to have an appraisal in it. So they'll have their own appraiser do their calculation of what they think that easement is worth. They will definitely give you another deadline, typically 14 days, and that they want a response from you. Again, not a real deadline. It's just what they want you to think. And then at this point is really a critical time to get an attorney involved if you're interested in having someone on your side. So that you can help you evaluate, well, what is wrong with this appraisal? I know it's lower than I want, but is there something in there that we can attack? Is there something in there that they're missing in terms of the value of your property? Patrick's going to talk about damages, the part taken, and damages to the remainder, and what that means and that calculation. So this is a really important time that and many times when we see landowners, okay, they start getting serious that, oh, this is the final offer. I need to really engage with this and try and figure out what's going on. So then after the final offer, also part of the final offer, you will get a copy of the landowner's Bill of Rights. It's a document published by the Attorney General that has some information about what your rights are. But they make the written offer. Many times it's low, and it's a lowball offer. And there'll also be, as a part of that offer, the easement that you will be granting to them. So in the terms of it. So that is also important to look at, and start to negotiate with the right-of-way agent and the pipeline company. So these terms can be negotiated, but importantly, you've got to talk about compensation. That's not just compensation for purchasing, taking the easement or the property, but also, is it going to take out a house or a shed or a big fancy gate that you just built, or a fence? All of those things will be calculated in that compensation, or should be calculated in that compensation that you need to be considering for. And then remainder issues. So what is not just the easement that they take, but what is the value or the devaluation of the rest of your property now that there's a pipeline on it? And now that you can't do as much as you wanted to on your property. Additionally, there are above ground appurtenances. Appurtenances is just a fancy lawyer word that is for just things that come above the ground that aren't the pipeline. Sometimes they are just, you see them a lot of water lines where they have like the looks like out of Mario, They have the pipes that come out and stick out, but there are many, you need to make sure there's cathodic protections that go on. They'll have other above ground appurtenances. So you want to make sure that you know what those are going to be on your property and if they're coming on your property, and make sure you have that as part of your easement terms as well. So some of the other items that can be negotiated, restoration of your land and protecting your land that way. Particularly, they're going to reseed the easement. They're not going to put your trees back, but they will reseed it. But you want to make sure that they're using the correct, doing it at the correct time, using the correct seed blend. You don't want that just washing off and not taking hold. Making sure that they've removed what they said they were going to remove, that there's not just a bunch of construction trash or pieces of metal or anything like that still on your property. Rock removal. If you live in somewhere where there's more rocky soil, you don't want them there's a chance you can, when they dig all it up, there's a chance that you can take some of those rocks with you. You might want them to put them somewhere. So that's something you can negotiate. Those temporary construction easements, right? Those aren't permanent, but they still will take out your trees. So you want to make sure that they are, that you're looking at the terms for that. What is the length of that temporary construction easement? You want to make sure you limit them as much as possible so they're not encumbering your land any longer. Access road easements. Is their easement going to affect your access, right? We had some other clients on the Enterprise pipeline where they couldn't, at one point during construction, they could not get to their house, right? Because they're building the pipeline that goes across their driveway. And so there were some issues with that and trying to make sure that they still have that access, that the pipeline company is communicating with them about that access. Like I said, fences and gates, that's a big one. There are going to be some markers in the permanent easement to say that, hey, there is a natural gas pipeline, and they're required to put those markers in every 100 feet. So that will be in your landscape. You have liability protections. You want to make sure that you aren't going to be held responsible or liable for anything, any negligence, anything that happens with the pipeline. Your future use of the property, can you not do something with your property that you were planning on doing because of the pipeline? And then also abandonment provisions. I think a lot of people forget this because for the most part, once a pipeline goes in your ground, it's staying in your ground. It's really hard to get out of it. But because these easements run with the land. So when you sell it, it's part of the property essentially forever, unless you can somehow, unless you can negotiate abandonment provision, if you can, make that a little stricter on the pipeline companies. If you don't have an abandonment provision in your easement, it is very difficult to prove an abandoned pipeline in Texas, and you have to get a court order. You have to sue them to get that determination. So abandonment provisions can make that process a little bit easier on landowners. Now Patrick's going to talk to you about the compensation for the taking and how that's calculated.
Yeah, and a couple of additional items on the easement. I think I mentioned this, but I want to emphasize one of the big issues is you can't build on the easement, so you can't build a structure. Anything that's a fixture or that's permanent on this 50-foot permanent easement. Once the 75-foot temporary easement is gone, then you can on that. But you can still graze cattle, you can still run livestock, you can still have crops. We usually negotiate utility issues. So if somebody wants to develop a piece of property, you can't develop on the pipeline corridor or the permanent easement. But we try to negotiate the ability to put utilities across the permanent easement, so you can put additional utility lines in order to develop the piece of property. I have a client up in Prosper who has a high-end, beautiful multi-million-dollar subdivision there, and there's a big empty space that's just a line through the development. And every once in a while, you'll see an orange marker, and that is a gas pipeline. People have built around it, but it's such a high density area and demand for the real estate is so high, people are willing to go ahead and buy real estate and build a home that's closer into the pipeline as compared to say Lampasas County, where we have clients in Lampasas County. They don't want to have the pipeline across their rural property, and it may be developed at some point in time, like Williamson County or even Burnett County right now. But there's all sorts of considerations to be taken into in consideration when you're negotiating an easement. Because if a petition and condemnation is filed, it will have the basic easement terms that's required by law. But if it's not required by law, it typically won't be in there. And if you don't negotiate an easement, you're going to get stuck with what the limitations are on their particular easement in their petition and condemnation. The compensation issue is a big one, and we learned a lot on gas pipelines through in particular the Hill Country, related to Gillespie and Blanco and Hayes in particular, and even Caldwell. The Kinder Morgan Permian Highway Pipeline eventually started paralleling existing pipelines, both to the east and to the west. But when it came to the first time that landowners had their first pipeline in an area that they're not used to having pipelines. So, I mean, South Texas, other parts of Texas, it's just part of the way of life and having various types of pipelines. They even have a client in Burnett County who now has 4 pipelines, or in Schlager County, they have 4 pipelines, but they're all right next to each other. These situations we're talking about right now, and some of the examples I want to give you, is the first pipeline and the impacts on the valuation of the property or devaluation of the property as a result of having a 42-inch natural gas pipeline. Stepping back, considerations, there's 2 concepts in appraisal methodology related to the taking of land for a pipeline. It is the red part, which is the taken, that's the 50-foot permanent easement, and the impact to the devaluation of the property for the remaining portion. So those 2 takeaways for you this evening is, what's the part taken? When I say taken, it is because it is taken through the condemnation process. It's not an arm's length sale. You're not selling an easement for private purposes. This is a condemnation where the property is being taken. A lot of companies don't believe there's any damages to the remainder. We believe there is, and we have data to support that. So what is the value of what's being taken is one issue. And then what is the impact to the remaining part of the property? Now, it depends on what the highest and best use of the property is. A lot of people ask me, well, is an appraisal on a condemnation the same as a bank appraisal? No. Is it the same as a refi appraisal? No. It is not the same type of appraisal, because not only do you have the land values involved and what is the value of the land, but you have what is the value of the taking, what is the value of the remainder, and how do you come up with that number? So if the land is being used for commercial, of course, it's going to be a higher price per square foot as compared to recreational purposes or agricultural purposes. So what is the land being used for? What is the highest and best use of land? In certain areas, it may be farmland, but there's subdivisions completely all the way around. So the highest and best use of the property is not for agricultural purposes, it's for high density residential and commercial development, which bumps up the value of the property, which bumps up the value of what's being taken. And if it limits the development, it may impact the remainder to even a greater degree. So what's the impact of the land and to the structures, as Carly talked about? And on this example, we're making a fairly simple example. It's going to go along the boundary line of the property. What if it goes through the middle of the property, from corner to corner? It bisects the property. Well, that's a different valuation as compared to whether it just barely clips the corner of the property. So every property is unique. The impact to every property is unique. And so you can't extrapolate on one particular property and impact of that property to all the other adjoining properties. So the next slide It gives a little bit better idea of what the Supreme Court says. And the Supreme Court of Texas basically said the compensation is the value of the land before the encumbrance, before the pipeline, and after. What is the total devaluation? Now, a lot of companies in their appraisals say, well, I'm going to give you the value of the land for the 50-foot easement, and then I'm going to damage it 50% because you can't build on it. So that part of the land is devalued 50%. Our appraisal methodology is a little bit different, and I would disagree with the 50%. I think it's more like 90%. But I'll show you our methodology, which is allowed by the Texas Supreme Court. It's a little bit different. But think about it as a whole. What is the value of the whole land before, and what's the whole land value after the impact of a new easement with a pipeline on your property? The next slide is some examples, real life examples of what we learned over the last few years from the Kinder Morgan PHP, Permian Highway Pipeline, which is also a 42-inch gas pipeline. So it's the same type of pipeline, just in a different area. This is an example that I want to walk you through. This particular property was a little less than 53 acres. The Kinder Morgan's appraisal, which is JLL as a company, said, the property's valued at $13,500. We don't disagree too much with that. The next slide will show $14,000. But the 50-foot permanent easement is taking 1.6 acres. JLL's opinion, which is allowed, because appraisal methodology is not an exact science. There's a lot of opinions that go into it. And their opinion is 50%. So they take the 1.6 acres times the 13.5 thousand an acre, and 50% of that is $10,962. That's what this appraisal company believes the value of the permanent easement being taken is. Now, there's a temporary easement that's considered rent for 1.5 years. You only get 10% according to them. So adequate compensation under Chapter 21 and the U.S. and state constitutions, and their opinion is $16,707. Now, our appraisal took a different methodology and came up with a very different number, and the same acreage, close 14 instead of 13.5. But we believed, based on supporting data, that the property on this size is devalued 35%. So Carl, if you'll show that 35% with your cursor, but the 35% diminution in value of the whole property, which is $257 and $691. Then you add the temporary easement in, and then we get total adequate compensation, $261,000. Big difference between those two numbers. And a lot of people ask, well, how's that possible? Well, it's possible because the Supreme Court of Texas allows appraisers, as long as they're ethical and using appropriate data, they have different opinions. Our opinion is the 261. Kinder Morgan's opinion was the 16. Now, what this does is create a very difficult situation to resolve the case unless there's a meeting of the minds, whether you want to split the number between the two numbers or whatever. Because the methodology is so different, it's hard sometimes to get these cases settled. So you end up having to go to what's called the special commissioners hearings. Carly mentioned that special commissioners hearings are after a petition and condemnation is filed, after they're required under the property code, 30-day notice, an appraisal, 14-day notice, then comes the petition and condemnation. Then that particular judge appoints 3 landowners in the county. So if it's Hays County, 3 landowners in Hays County are appointed as special commissioners to decide compensation. They don't decide easement terms, just compensation. They have to be landowners in the county and disinterested, so they can't be impacted by the particular project. There's a concept, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but what this means, how did we get that 35%? Well, our appraisers, and this particular one is Bolton and Mr. Bolton, Mr. Ezel, they had data that supported land sales. You take 2 land sales, take 200-acre tracts, particularly square tracts, One does not have a pipeline, the other does have a pipeline. And if the one with the pipeline sells for less than the one without the pipeline, all other things considered to be the same, what is the difference in the sales price? That number can be anywhere from 14 to 40% essentially, depending on how the pipeline crosses the particular property. That's called paired sales analysis. So if you talk to a condemnation appraiser and they give you a quote for their appraisal and you go, whoa, that's not $1,500 appraisal like I'm used to for a refi. It may be $5,000, $7,500, maybe $10,000, maybe $12,000, all depend on the particular appraiser and the approach taken. But they work really hard to get this paired sales data. And as I mentioned, it's the land value plus the paired sales data and what is this percentage. So in the example I gave you, we believe the percentage was 35%. We went to a special commissioner's hearing in Blanco County, and the commissioners fully understood that because all the commissioners were brokers, realtors who knew the county and who knew sales data in the county. And they basically said, listen, this land is going to sell for less money because it's got a 42-inch natural gas pipeline. What are you doing, appraiser for the utility company? Where did you get your data? And they went our way. So the next slide shows you some really interesting data that this is real numbers, everybody. This is real numbers. And Blanco and Hayes and well, I don't think we have any Gillespie, but we have lots of these numbers. This is just an example. On the left is JLL's appraisal for the utility company. And you can see those numbers. The first one is what I was talking about, the 16707. We were at 261, where the award was 233 for the special commissioners. And the case was resolved. If you look at some of these other examples, you go, oh my gosh, look at this one that is at the next to the bottom. Well, in Blanco County, the 2739, then 930 was the appraisal. They gave 1,300,000. How do they give more than what the appraisal methodology is? Well, under the Supreme Court, they have to give a number between the two appraisal numbers. So the most that they could actually get is the 930 under this scenario. But these commissioners believe that the paired sales analysis was not good enough because there was nothing that equated to a 42-inch gas line. Paired sales related to like a 24-inch gas line or a 30-inch gas line. What is the impact of a 42-inch gas line? So these commissioners said, you know what? We believe the impact is much greater, so we're going to give more money. So you look at the total value just of these numbers at 107 versus appraised value at 5 million. That's the kind of numbers that we can be talking about with with these particular pipelines when you go through areas that don't have existing pipelines on them. So when we represent our clients, our job is to get the best terms of the easement and the most value for the compensation, because this is a one-time payment. A lot of people ask, well, can I get royalties? Can I get monthly royalties on what the company is making on their net revenues? Answer is no. These are, yes, they're private companies, but the Supreme Court of Texas, and had a question on this, has said that the private company is providing gas for a public purpose as a common carrier. They have eminent domain authority. So we can't stop it. Many people have tried, and the Supreme Court says no. So they're going to have eminent domain authority. That's just the way it is right now, unless they're a private company, which is a totally different issue, separate type of negotiations. When I say private company, I mean, this is a private company, but a private company that does not have eminent domain authority. They do. So it's about the valuation because of one-time payment and the terms of the easement. So we zealously represent our clients and are very passionate about the impact to landowners. And some landowners say go away. Well, sometimes the companies do move off of them and go to a neighbor. But if you say go away and resist having a survey, which is the initial part of the process, they can actually go and get a court order and force you to allow them on the property to do the surveys. So we usually do right of entry agreements, and that's a separate agreement that we haven't really talked about. But turn this back over to Carly. I know we're coming up on 7 o'clock to see if we have any questions. Carly, you have anything to finish up before we?
No, this is just our contact information. You've got our email address, and which is also on our website, and our phone number. And then
I did see we had one last question come in here, Carly.
yeah,
Can a landowner sue for compensation for depreciation of their property for a pipeline installed at or near a property line on an adjacent property?
The answer is no. If the pipeline is not impacting your property directly, meaning there's no easement, whether it's temporary or permanent, on your property, then you are not entitled to any compensation. That's called a community damage. For example, if you have a property and a new transmission line goes across the road on your neighbor's property line, and you have a beautiful view of the sunsets or your back porch, and now you're looking at transmission line as the sunset goes down. If that's not on your property, you get the impact of the view, the negative impact. Could it devalue your property? It's possible, and it certainly can, and I think it will. But if it's not on you, you're not entitled to any compensation. The Texas Supreme Court said that's a community damage. Everybody who's not directly impacted absorbs that damage.
I think we had a question earlier about trees being compensated for in your damages model, but unfortunately in Texas, you do not get compensation for your trees. You get it for the land. Now there might be an argument that you've got a lot of beautiful heritage oak trees, and that makes your property more valuable in terms of like a price per acre. But you can't get an arborist out there to say, well, these trees are worth $200,000, and then expect a payment from the pipeline company about it. That's not, unfortunately, that's not how it works, which I know is very very upsetting to a lot of people. So then we have the last thing I'm going to say is that we do we do have a landowner alert system. This is an email newsletter that we send out every 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on the news that's happening. But it is really just what we think is interesting, what's going on with pipelines or landowner issues or eminent domain. Easements, whatever real estate issues in Texas, we will send out articles or blog posts or whatever we find it is interesting that we think landowners in the state should know. In any events like this one that might be coming up that we might be doing at Braun and Gesham, we are condemnation attorneys, but we are ultimately landowner attorneys. So any kind of issue you have on the litigation or the transactional side, we've probably handled it before. So that's what our landowner alert system is. We don't try to spam you. It's just, like I said, every 2 weeks. So if you're interested in some more information like this, or please sign up and subscribe. We'd appreciate it. So, and I think that's it.
Definitely. And we include invitations to any upcoming webinars in our landowner alert system newsletter. I will be sending out a follow-up email that will include the link to this webinar recording. It'll include our contact information. Maybe you come away from this webinar and you have a question that comes up later. Please don't hesitate to reach out. And it will also have the link to sign up here. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you do have any follow-up questions. Otherwise, we'll let you go. And Carly, Patrick, thank you so much for your time this evening and for all of the really good information around this project.
Yeah, and I want to just thank all the attendees for taking time out this Wednesday evening to attend. We do provide a consultation, a 30-minute consultation that is of no charge. So if you want to email us or Avalon and talk more about this. I know there's a lot of questions that you probably have and you're going to think about afterwards. And there's a lot of complex legal issues related to various aspects of these particular projects, but we're happy to take your call and visit with you about your situation, because like I said, every situation is different. So I want to thank you. Thanks, Avalon, for setting this up. And Carly, great job. And thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.